FingerLakes1.com. Welcome to the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined by Ted Baker of Finger Lakes Morning News over at WGVA and WAUB. We're tackling the headlines like we do every week, going a little bit above and beyond. The weather should have been the only big story this week, but obviously not the case.
I'm very happy for the space heater that you've placed at my feet here, because the usual in-studio temperature here is at about the 50s.
Yeah, and part of that is to keep our guests on edge when they come in for other shows. But, you know, you're a regular, so we want to keep you comfortable. So the travel ban that was or was not, I guess, would be the more apt term. Big rigs ignored state request after the travel ban was placed on Tuesday. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there was a 19-car pileup after that on Wednesday. Maybe not specifically related to the ban, but it's just ironic. You know, you close roads, you do what you're supposed to do at the state level, or in theory what you should be doing, and then boom, pileup happens because people were ignoring it. So yesterday I started to see a lot of this debate on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter. Some people saying the governor doesn't have a place to, the governor shouldn't be instituting these types of bans. Other folks saying, yo, hang on, maybe people should follow the bans and maybe we need to figure out a better way to enforce them. We've covered winter, both of you and I have covered winter storms aplenty. Does something need to change in the way this type of situation is handled in the future, you think?
Well, I've always had a couple of thoughts about these things. Number one is we're a society that doesn't really stop. Commerce goes on, business goes on. So when we get these county travel bans, for example, or travel advisories, no unnecessarily travel, if I have to be at the shift at the convenience store at 6 a.m., then I'm going to travel. And I don't think my boss is going to accept my apology that, gee, I couldn't come in because there was a travel advisory. So I think that's one side of it, is we're the society that doesn't want to stop. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's a blizzard. People are still going to want to go to the grocery store and pick up what they pick up. The second thing about this, and this kind of just popped into my head yesterday, is that a lot of these things, I think, are a relic of a time when we needed the government to provide us this information. We don't need it anymore. We have better information than they do. If the roads are bad, I don't need to wait for the sheriff's deputies to tell me. 8 of my friends are going to post pictures of it on social media. I think that in a lot of ways, government hasn't kept up with the changing times in terms of information technology. We don't need the county sheriff anymore to tell us how the roads are. We can very easily find out on our phone.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of interesting. I feel like it makes sense for some of the more rural communities, the communities maybe where you don't have as many people out and about defining what things are like. But then the flip side of that is how many people are actually traveling those roads. You know, take some of the more rural routes in Seneca and Ontario County and even Yates County, that trek that you make from Rushville to Geneva every morning, I'm sure includes a couple side roads that get a little hairy in the winter.
Yeah.
But those folks know, most people know, I think, to avoid those types of roads when the weather goes south. You're right. I do think it's a little bit archaic. But if the state, so here's what I was thinking about. It's like, if the state is going to follow through on this, because one of the mind-numbing things that I kept seeing on social media was, why weren't the toll booth workers stopping the trucks? It's not the responsibility of a toll booth worker to enforce what effectively becomes law when the governor makes a ruling that X, Y, and Z highways are shut down, whether they're interstates or what have you. If state police are not effectively able to handle the number of violators, because I think that actually becomes an issue. We've seen since that, or at least I have, this was not the first time that the Thruway was closed this winter. This was, I think, like the second or third time at least that the Thruway has been closed. And up until after this 19-car pileup, I didn't see any coverage on any news, whether it was Rochester, Buffalo media. I saw absolutely no coverage of state troopers basically enforcing the bans that had been put in place for large commercial vehicles. After the pileup, all of a sudden we start to see the 30, 45 second, 1 minute clips of, oh yeah, this is totally happening. They're enforcing it. Obviously, the enforcement isn't happening well enough. And maybe that means we need physical barriers. If you're going to shut down a highway, maybe you need to have some sort of, and I don't mean like a roadblock or what have you, but maybe like a checkpoint where you have a higher density of law enforcement posted up at that spot where you want to close it off for those vehicles.
Right. I think if you're going to have a law, you need to be able to enforce it. Because if you can't enforce it, that just leads to more disrespect for the law. So shut the Thruway down or like you say, get some patrols out there. But, I was thinking about this the other day. If I'm an owner-operator and I've got a load that needs to be in Pittsburgh, then I got to get that load to Pittsburgh. If I don't, somebody else will, and they'll find someone else to do it. It's just the reality of business and commerce in the 21st century. It doesn't stop for anybody. And in terms of these accidents, I've been noticing this phenomenon over the last few weeks that we've had winter weather. It seems to be that increasingly a lot of people don't change the way they drive at all for winter conditions. They continue to go 60. They want to get where they want to get. And that's great until you have to hit the brakes. That's what happens with these pileups. Everybody, you can go 65 on the Thruway when it's a little slippery, and it's not a problem until a deer runs out or one guy hits his brakes and he spins and the guy behind him hits his brakes, and then all of a sudden you got 21 cars and a couple of tractor-trailer rigs in a pile.
Yeah, and I thought sort of to put a cherry on top of the point that I was making with the toll booth workers. These are the people who are going to have their jobs eliminated within the next year. Like they have any incentive to care even beyond the scope of their normal responsibilities to also care about what vehicles are actually making their way onto the Thruway. And I also think that argument or that question sort of disregards the fact that most, when you're talking about, for example, I travel between 41 and 46 on the Thruway. That's the Henrietta exit and the Waterloo exit. When it shuts down at 46 or 47, most of the trucks that are on the Thruway traveling through that area have gotten on long before 46 or 47.
Right.
So the idea that they were let on or that you're going to, what are you doing? Like at exit 43, 42, 41 and every other exit, you screening vehicles? Where are you going? I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. It would be the worst implementation of trying to execute this idea of law. It would just be crazy.
Well, and the other thing is this all looks very silly coming from the governor to begin with. If the Thruway needs to be restricted or shut down, we have a Thruway authority. Let them decide. Let law enforcement decide. I mean, the governor's coming out today talking about ratcheting up the penalties, and we're going to make seriously, you're going to make a criminal penalty against a truck driver because he wants to deliver his load? I mean, back off a little bit, Governor.
Yeah, and the state's the main trucking association in the state came out with their statement. Obviously, they said they support the ban when necessary, but then sort of threw on as a plus to that, hey, it does affect our bottom line. It does affect business.
Right.
And it's interesting because I guarantee you, it seems with this particular ban, it seemed to happen a little earlier than it maybe should have. I believe it went into effect Tuesday night, and really the bad weather didn't start until midday or a little after on Wednesday. So you're talking like a 12 to 36 hour window where you could have been a little more, I understand erring on the side of caution, but when you're talking about, businesses and humans' ability to make a living, that's where I think you kind of have to think about the dollars and cents of that decision too.
And again, in this era of instant information, it shouldn't be hard to institute something like this when it's needed. You've got all those signs that light up when there's an Amber Alert or whatever, so light them up when there's a weather alert.
Right, and I mean, the other part of it too is, say there is a catastrophic snowstorm of all things. These truck drivers are used to dealing with these types of weather events. So what are they going to do? They're going to be traveling. They will, when it gets to be too bad or, when that decision is made, if it is made later, they're just going to get off at whatever exit they're closest to or whatever place nearest makes sense for them. and they're going to pull off and they're going to do what they would do anyway, which is
well, so
wait it out.
maybe that's the solution, is to let people use their judgment and common sense. I've been talking about the decisions to close and delay schools. Mm-hmm. I would love to see a superintendent come out and say, yes, it's going to be very cold. Our school is going to be open today. If you as a parent don't feel comfortable sending your child to school, that's your prerogative as a parent. Don't send them to school. But for the rest of us who think that it's okay and have warm coats and hats, we're going to school.
Yeah, that's sort of the back end of this whole debate, which is under what circumstances should a school cancel. I do think it's a little archaic at this point to have individual administrators at schools making the decision. To me, that just doesn't seem like the most. So in a county, like use Seneca County as an example, you could have using this as an example, the emergency management office be the one who ultimately makes the call for the schools. They're the ones who are in contact with the highway department folks. They're the ones who are in contact with the sheriff's office, who have deputies out on the road. They're the ones who, for lack of a better term, have boots on the ground.
I was just talking to a school superintendent earlier this week who would probably love that, because
it takes
her phone rings about 800 times every time these decisions come up.
Exactly. And then they aren't the ones, the administrators aren't the ones who have to bear the burden when the decision is either right, wrong, or indifferent, depending on what subjective set of eyes is,
Well, and what we've seen come into play, we saw this again yesterday with the cold, is the idea is that if it's really bad, we close, and if it's not quite so bad, we delay. But the purpose of a delay is when conditions are going to get significantly better. So if you have a snowstorm that ends at 3 o'clock in the morning, then okay, a 2-hour delay might make sense, because that's 2 extra hours to plow the roads. When it's 0 degrees at 6 o'clock and it's 0 degrees at 9 o'clock, it doesn't make any sense. We had schools yesterday delaying school for 2 hours. Why?
Auburn, I believe,
it's
was
still,
one of them, right?
They were one, and then they flipped over to being closed,
which
I always make fun of those schools as the flipper schools. And so, yeah, the whole system, again, why not just say we're going to be open, and if you're not comfortable as a parent sending your child to school, don't.
Yeah, I think it's one of those scenarios where until there is a really decent policy that most people can agree on, everyone's not going to agree. But I think it's going to continue being this really polarizing thing every time it snows. We listen to, I hate to say it, hate to brand it this way, but we listen to older folks say, "Oh my God, I walked to school 15 miles in knee-high snow and I didn't complain once, and all of these kids are getting days off because it's 0 degrees in New York State." It is much less, to me, and we talked about it on another podcast earlier this week, in my mind, is much less about this is a haves and have-nots situation. I think that the students who, do not have the right circumstances, the right clothes, the right environments to be able to not have to stand out at that bus stop for an extended period of time, the people who have those who don't have access to those types of things, they're the ones that these decisions are ultimately being made for.
Well, and the other generational change is, in my generation, I didn't walk 12 miles uphill both ways, but in all seriousness, growing up in northern New Hampshire, in 12 years of public schooling, we had maybe 1 or 2 days off ever. But what has changed is, in that generation, if the kids stayed home from school, mom was probably a stay-at-home mom, and there wasn't a problem. Unfortunately, we have come to rely on our schools as government-subsidized daycare, and it creates huge problems for families when both parents work if all of a sudden the kids have to be home. Where are you going to take them? Who's going to watch them? Or it's a delay, so you're making arrangements. Now it's not a delay. Now it's closed. That's a whole other part of this puzzle, is that we rely on schools to be daycare. We rely on schools to feed kids. We rely on our schools for a lot of things that they weren't really originally designed to be.
And it's funny because I think that's kind of there are just so many issues with the way that part of this whole discussion happens in my mind, because I'm sitting here thinking to myself, and I am not a parent, but I'm sitting here thinking to myself, Are these not the things you consider before you have a child? These types of like sort of situational things that you sort of think about, and if you wind up going on Facebook after the school cancels and you have to sort of scramble last minute to find a daycare solution, a babysitter, is that the rest of the world's fault, or is that your own fault? And I know it sounds really sort of critical and harsh to say that, but I would much rather a full-grown adult have to scramble to find a babysitter for their kid than make their kid stand out at a bus stop in minus 30-degree feeling air and make them have to sit on that bus, which is a lot colder than this studio gets, unfortunately. And, you know, there are so many red flags that pop up into my mind when that happens, and I get it. Like, it's tough, and I understand. I have friends who are parents that are my age, and they go through all of these same sort of dilemmas, and I get the challenge there, but I also, at the same time, definitely don't want to hear you complain about it in the process, because that's just, you know, unless you're contributing to part of this discussion, which is how are we going to make this better, you're just complaining about a situation that doesn't really play out ideally for you. And I'm sorry, but the kids come first, right?
Yeah, and also let's keep in mind when we talk about societal changes, part of this is fear of liability or lawsuit. If a school bus crashes in a snowstorm because the superintendent didn't call school, then you all know the phone number from the ads on TV to call and get your attorney and file a suit. So I think that plays into a lot of these decisions is risk of liability. Schools don't want to be held responsible if something bad happens to the kids because they didn't call school.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And there again, it gets a lot of these issues that we end up talking about are sort of deep rooted in these like long-term big issues, like, you know, childcare tied into education, tied into, you know, food scarcity, and like there's all the transportation, like all of these things are interconnected. One of the other things we're going to be talking about. So Mark Nicholson, co-owner of Red Jacket Orchards, discussed with Finger Lakes One earlier this week the at times controversial H-2A work program. So Red Jacket, we learned, employed a total of 35 foreign workers last year in 2018. All were from Mexico. Nicholson said that statistics show that for every migrant farm position that we have out there on the farm, there are 4 additional full-time domestic jobs that are created at that business's function. He also cited the necessity of programs like that because, one, the workforce for these positions is scarce, picking fruit and things of that nature. And two, it also has an impact on the nation's food security as far as the homegrown products go. He added that the average consumer may not realize how many times a product has been touched by a migrant worker by the time they finally buy it at the store. And this was kind of more of a story last year. It was published in the DNC, the Finger Lakes Times, a bunch of when this whole, frankly, when the wall discussion was really going full bore. I think that's one of the things that sometimes folks, especially in rural parts of the Finger Lakes, kind of conveniently forget. That it's not just the farms in the southern part of the U.S. that are relying on migrant workers, but even those way up here in Wayne County, it's very common. We just happened to connect with an operation in Ontario County, but it all contributes to the same problem. And when you hear that as the backdrop, my curiosity is: do you feel is that kind of the attitude that you think is necessary to sort of bring this into a more realistic place as far as the discussion goes?
Well, I think that's what gets lost when you have the two tribes chanting slogans to each other. You know, build the wall, build the wall. Well, the truth is there are a lot of migrants, both legal and illegal, who come to the United States for harvest or planting time and then maybe go back home, or they come here in our growing season and go someplace like Texas and California in theirs. My drive home takes me by a lot of the cabbage fields in Gorham and Stanley, and I see, and frankly, there's been a lot of times I've seen those workers out there, and I've been half tempted to grab my recorder and pull over to the side of the road and go talk to them and find out their stories. Are you legal? Are you illegal? How did you get here? That's an issue that gets lost in a lot of the immigration debate. And I think the other thing that gets lost a lot is that these are skilled positions. There's a certain skill involved in picking fruit from an apple tree. It's not, you can't just show up with a big basket and start yanking apples off the tree. I mean, you can damage the product. So these workers have a skill set, even if they could be replaced with American-born, Native American workers, not Native American as in Indian, but native-born Americans, they might not have the knowledge needed to do the work.
Yeah, it's there again. I think you summed it up really well, and I don't even think there's much for me to add on that other than just this is what happens when you have the two sides chanting slogans. That's really what the issue is here, and it's one of the few places I think where, or one of the few instances where national policy actually does have an impact, a local impact. We don't see that as much because I think, like when the tax reform bill was passed last year, it's kind of like lukewarm whether you actually, if you're an average worker in New York State, how much of an improvement you really saw in your paycheck or anything like that. But there again, it shines a light on something that I think doesn't get enough attention, and I think you're absolutely right as far as needing more of that dialogue and more of that, finding out these people's stories to put a little more context behind it. That way it's not just sort of a those people situation where people they're given the benefit of not being able to actually know the people that in some cases they're speaking very harshly about.
Well, I've made the point on the Finger Lakes Morning News on a couple of occasions that according to the figures that I've seen, more than 50% of illegal immigrants are people who get legal visas and simply overstay and don't go home. A wall won't do anything about that at all. Mm-hmm. So, just to insist build the wall, I think in this case what Republicans are largely saying build the wall, Democrats are saying we need to take a look at this whole picture of who wants in, and let's make it easy for the people that we want to have come in, or easier, and then we can talk about barriers to keep out the people that we don't. But they're just, the idea that there are hordes of people just sneaking into America, have there been some? Sure, there have been over the years, but those numbers have gone down. And frankly, some of the rhetoric is a reason why. If I'm in Mexico, do I want to come to America right now and be shouted down on the street and told to go back home? I mean, we have third generation Americans because they speak with a Hispanic accent or have brown skin, and somebody's yelling at them to go home, and they're saying, I was born here.
Yeah, it's a far from ideal situation. Something a little closer to home. Stands in Waterloo. They're going to be closing later this month. Owner Lee Bieber told Finger Lakes One yesterday afternoon that running stands and the previously operated West Main Kitchen, both on Main Street, it's a financial struggle. He said in a candid conversation after the news broke that the community simply didn't support stands or West Main. As is ultimately necessary to make any business work, you need the community's support. I have some thoughts about this, but I want to get what you think first. Obviously, this was if we got a headline every time a business closed, I think it would be more eye-opening to people, just as far as the kind of turnover that actually exists. But we don't, and this was one of those rare cases where we actually got it. So what do you think?
Well, the restaurant business is by nature, it's a pretty low-margin business. You don't make a big profit margin, and there are new ones opening all the time. So I think there's probably a lot of turnover in that industry. And I was thinking about this because we were going to talk about this morning on the radio, and we had some various computer meltdowns and things, so we didn't have our usual radio chat. So as I was thinking about that issue, I'm wondering generationally, do young people go to restaurants as much as they did? And we were talking, I think we talked on this podcast a while back about the, is it Good Eats? Is that the name of the company in Geneva?
Yes.
That packages gourmet food to go that you put in a boiling bag. So I'm wondering if there might be a generational shift away from the idea of going to restaurants. It's always been a very tough business. Probably for every restaurant that starts, there's probably about a 50% failure rate. A lot of times you don't really hear about it because they start up and they don't last very long.
Yeah, so me and my fiance, actually, we've been doing a meal prep service, one of the national ones, not the Good Eats version, where you actually sort of prepare the food. They give you the ingredients and you prepare the food yourself. So I think part of the problem, as far as because this is basically an economic development problem for Seneca County and like counties in the region, Yates County, Schuyler County. I don't think you have enough young people. We have effectively lost that 20 to say 49-year-old demographic, or at least that's been the area where we've lost the most. And I think what you wind up, because of that, you have brain drain. Because of that, you have a lack of economic development and ingenuity and new things and people spending money. And what you're left with are effectively an older generation that has a different sort of is more accustomed to the type of dinner experience that they may get at a place like the Deluxe in Geneva, or what was Emil's also in Geneva, or some of the mainstays like the Hollywood in Auburn, those types of places, rather than wanting sort of what was in Stan's a new age version of what a grill and bar would be.
Right.
I think if you don't have the right people to support inside of a community to support an endeavor like that, and I think that's why you see a lot of the chains sort of stay away from even a place like Geneva. I mean, a place, you think would be able to support a Chili's and Applebee's, but Auburn has those things and Geneva does not. I think there's a reason for that because they look at the numbers, they look at the demographics, and they're going by what they're seeing, which is there aren't a lot of those young middle-aged folks, or even the millennials, or the 20 to 30 somethings, and that's really what you need. Because I actually think the opposite is true. Just knowing, I'm 28 years old, I know a whole lot of 20 and 30 somethings, and we go out to eat far more than we sit home and make a nice meal for ourselves. A lot of that has to do with some folks living with family members like parents, et cetera, where they don't have it's not their kitchen, so why are they going to sit in there and make, they'll go to the drive-thru, or they'll go to Chili's or Applebee's, they'll go to Parker's, or whatever the case may be. And then the other sort of arm of that is when they do, and this is why we actually started looking at meal prep services as an opportunity, it's so difficult. And I do think older folks have the same problem. It is so difficult to make a meal for two people if you don't eat leftovers. That is, and this is a really weird conversation to have on this podcast, but basically that's what it comes down to. Like, it's not like cooking for a family is easy because you can cook in bulk and it will get eaten over time.
Right.
Or you're serving for a larger, if you go to the store and you just, Jim Sinacropi and we were talking about it on FLX Weekly a couple weeks ago, like, if we go to the store to make a meal, even if it's just for two people or three people, you end up spending like $55-$60 at the grocery store on all of these things to make this meal. And for what? There's waste. There's things you don't use. You get more than you need. Maybe the food just doesn't get eaten. The ingredients end up going bad that you don't end up using. Whereas the meal prep service gives you the exact amount of stuff that you need to do it or thereabouts, and there's less waste, there's less thought process. You don't have to go to the store because my generation also is not going to the store the way previous generations did. They're using things like Instacart, Amazon.
Right.
They're letting technology help them in that way. And, I think it's all of these factors together, and it creates this really, I think, tough environment. I think there's a reason why, and Chino's is incredible. We all know that. Sell Friends Own and company run a great business, but I think it's telling that the only major restaurant in Waterloo that's succeeded over the years is a pizzeria, an Italian restaurant.
Yeah.
Italian restaurant appeals to the predominantly Italian demographic here, and pizza appeals to everybody because pizza.
Well, and I think, maybe a concept like Stan's might have done better in downtown Geneva.
Oh, definitely.
Because you get that population. I think you make a very good point. There's the older generation, and I think it's partly taste and partly economics. You can go to Friendly's or chain restaurant and eat a lot of food pretty cheap, or there's all kinds of places now in downtown Geneva and in a few other places, but there's been that scene develop in Geneva for the farm to table and where you might spend more money for a meal and get a nice bottle of wine with it. There's kind of, again, we've developed this theme in these podcasts over the last few times that we've done it of just the sort of the changing generational and demographic outlook of America and the way that's going to change fundamental things like how we get our food and where we get it from and do we go to restaurants or do we order it from a meal prep service. I think these are fascinating and also kind of scary changes that are ahead for us as a country.
So the byproduct of this type of situation or economy, I guess you could call it, is the phenomenon that I think this is just me speaking off the cuff, and this is my opinion, no one else's. Look at the Finger Lakes Mall in Aurelia/Auburn, whichever you want to call it. You have a bunch of what I'll call or classify as hobby businesses, people who are financially stable for reasons other than the business that they're in. They're stores that are maybe open 3 or 4 days a week or 2 days a week. People treating businesses like a part-time endeavor. And yet at the same time, that's what's been created. So we have that. And then at the same time, you have the state and government agencies and economic development folks saying, we need these small businesses to prosper so that they can take on and ultimately take out these big corporate operations, because that's what we want, right? That's what people keep saying they want more of. We want local, we want this, we want that. Well, as soon as people find out that local costs more, they're suddenly uninterested in local. And they're more, if it's a restaurant, they're saying, okay, I'll take whatever comes off the Cisco truck because it doesn't cost, $14 for a burger,
right,
when I can get a burger somewhere else for $6 or $7. And I kind of worry or wonder what an economy will really look like when, say, instead of 30 or 40%, and I don't know what the numbers are, I'm just taking a wild guess, when 30 or 40% as opposed to 70% are these sort of hobby businesses where they're only open a few days a week and you're fully relying on the corporate entities to be your mainstream of commerce. I really wonder what that ends up doing to the local economy in the long run.
Well, we're about to find out, because that's one of the most fundamental changes taking place in America is the way we shop for things. You look at malls. Malls traditionally had what we called anchor stores, and that was your Sears and your Pennies. How are they doing? Sears has gone through all kinds of trouble. Pennies has gone through all kinds of trouble. And you hit on it. We say we love our small local business, and we all, it's like the restaurant closing where somebody says, oh, did you hear that so-and-so restaurant closed? Oh, that's too bad. I love that place. When's the last time you went? 3 years ago. And so there's the problem. We all say we love our local business, but the Walmart parking lot's always pretty full. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I think these are fascinating issues. It goes back to, I think the last time I was here, I was talking about how I think we're going to reach a point where there aren't enough jobs for everyone to have a job.
Yep.
And then what do we do then? How do we... other nations have taken the leap to things like guaranteed incomes and things that go over in more socialist countries, maybe in Europe, that aren't going to fly here in the United States without some major changes in attitude.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because it's either a demographic issue where you're missing a certain part of the population, or alternatively, it's an economic one where there isn't enough discretionary income and folks just can't afford to go out to eat, and they're not as a result. It's a combination of both, I know, but I think a lot of times we look for sort of the one-dimensional answers, especially when it comes to those economic development folks and some of those other decision makers who ultimately shape what the Finger Lakes and what these individual counties look like.
Right. I mean, we've got to figure out, you mentioned it a moment ago, the brain drain. Young people don't see economic opportunity in upstate New York, so they go get hired at the Amazon warehouse in New York City, or they go out to the West Coast, or they go to the the Triad area in North Carolina that's high tech and everything. If we can't figure out how to keep those people here, then you're going to be left with my generation, and we're not going to be around that much longer.
So the Red Cross is helping 11 individuals who were devastated by a fire in East Bloomfield. The Valley Motel was serving as, I guess, permanent housing for a group of folks. I would assume they're lower income folks. They did not have insurance. The property obviously was a total loss. The owners are devastated. The folks who live there are devastated. They're working with the Red Cross to get the next steps, to get their plans together and how they're going to sort of continue on. Outpouring of support across the community. People are, I've seen it all over social, people saying, this is outrageous that this is happening, that we need to have better systems in place so that this doesn't happen. And I'm thinking to myself, the only way this happens or is prevented from happening in the future is if we have better affordable housing. This, when you have people, and a lot of these old school motels that were thriving in the 50s and 60s and early 70s when that sort of when that was common, that type of environment for staying on vacation was common. It's gone, and they've turned into housing units, which are hard. I mean, I think they're hardly adequate without serious renovation to be adequate housing. And the other part of it is there still aren't enough of them to go around, even in the most rural places. So it's like this is instance number 8,221 that reminds us we need to do better with affordable housing. Period. End of story.
I think we do, but it's also part of a larger issue in that we're seeing the increasing segregation, I guess, economically of society. The wealthy are getting wealthier, the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is kind of disappearing. And that's a tough one because that's a political question that brings a whole bunch of left-right stuff in there. But it's true. We don't have that thriving, prosperous middle class that has tended to be what drives our economy over the years. So we have poorer people looking for whatever housing they can find that they're going to be able to afford. And if it's substandard and there's a hole in the wall and the landlord hasn't fixed it, what are you going to do? You don't want to get kicked out. So, these are all... And it goes back to what we've talked about with some of these things like the DRI money, that a lot of it goes to the sort of big, shiny gateway projects like the Lakefront Visitor Center in Geneva, which is great. But I think that a lot of people are saying, why doesn't more of this money go to things that better the lives of everyday people, especially on the lower half of the socioeconomic scale? Yeah.
And even if... So here's one of the things that I when it gets politicized, when this conversation starts to get politicized, if all you can say is the government shouldn't be subsidizing it, you're not acknowledging that there's a problem. You're not saying that there isn't something wrong and that something has to be done. You're saying something has to be done. That's what you're saying by making that statement. Find a way to make it work. Find a way to make it happen. If it's a public-private partnership and that's how it needs to be pursued, pursue it. But as of now, I haven't seen anything. I haven't seen anything in the Finger Lakes of serious substance or of necessary breadth to actually address the extent of problems that this region has when it comes to affordable housing. Median rental prices are going up, and it is just one of the many factors that is ultimately driving people out of the area. When you can get, maybe twice as much in renting in a suburb in Rochester or Syracuse compared to living in the heart of the Finger Lakes, it's a brand. I get that. And I understand that, a lot of folks, this sort of debate for the developer, there's incentive for them to spend, say, 3 or 4 or 5% more when they're constructing one of these units or one of these spaces. Spend that little bit extra and you can charge 75 or 100% more as far as your monthly rent rate goes. I mean, it's hard because it's incentivized on that side for the developer. So you have to, I think the role of government is to figure out a way to incentivize it for the developer to go the other way as well. And I don't know how you do that. I'm not sure what the first step is, but I think to me, I think the first step is just political will.
Well, incentivize it or compel it. I'm not a big fan of government compelling people to do things, but the fact is it does. So if the government can compel me to buy car insurance, why can't it compel an apartment developer to make sure that 10% of the units he builds are affordable, or whatever percentage we can decide on? I mean, there's a lot of things that we spend our tax dollars on. So if we're going to do that, let's figure out a way to spend them on some things that will help lift a few people up.
Yeah, and I think we need to sort of, as a goal or a measuring stick to get to where we need to be, I think it has to start with saying we would like the housing stock to sort of reflect, and that's across the spectrum, ownership and rental, to reflect what the income is of the folks, what the income makeup is of the folks who live in that community. You know, if 30% of the population is surviving on less than $20,000 annually, then that's what 20 to 30% of the housing stock should reflect in a good way. I don't mean like rundown, awful places that are just abysmal for any human to have to live in. I'm talking about like having a sensible plan, incentivizing the developers to actually go in and approach these things and say, hey, we can do this. It's not a big deal. Maybe we won't do X, Y, and Z, things to excess, but we can keep the cost down so that it makes sense for us to do this. And I also think that you would see a lot more development across the whole spectrum if it was incentivized so that the developers were getting something out of it in the long term. I think one of the things that you could say is an indirect result of how costly it is to do business in New York State is the idea of these developers having to look at the more profitable options rather than the, say, average profitable options. Yeah.
I think part of this, too, is part of our theme for today of generational change. I think that rental housing was once seen as kind of a starter, and the ultimate goal was to marry and have 2.2 perfect American children and buy your home. And you can speak to this better than I can by being 30-plus years younger than I am. I think the younger generation, that's not necessarily the goal as much anymore. I think we see more households, I guess non-traditional households. People aren't necessarily as in a hurry to marry as they used to be or to have kids. Or I think people see the economy, and we can talk about the low unemployment, and that's great, but a lot of these jobs don't pay a whole lot of money. And I think a lot of younger people are looking at it and saying, I don't trust that my employer will still be my employer in 5 years. I don't think I'm going to make that leap to owning a house. I wouldn't be surprised if we're seeing people spend more time in rental housing than they did a generation or two ago.
Well, and I think the other aspect of it too is that when you are talking about ownership, I don't think the housing stock necessarily reflects what people of my generation want or are really looking for. A couple weeks ago, I had Ryan Wallace from Lake Tunnel Solar in, and we're talking about this move, and the units that they're producing are basically between 1,000 and 1,500 square feet, and that's
right.
it. And what do you see a lot of in all of these communities? You see a lot of, especially in the rural ones, you see a lot of these sort of cookie cutter developments that have these massive sprawling 2,500, 3,000 square foot homes that people my age aren't even remotely interested in having, because even if you
right.
have these homes, everybody knows a 50 or 60 something who still lives in this giant house, and they use two.
That's me.
You're raising your hand. They're living in 2, maybe 3 rooms, kitchen, living room, bedroom, and all of the dining room, the family room, the 2 or 3 spare bedrooms. They're they're sitting there empty. They become like half storage. And then these people who also have on top of that finished basements and all these other things that add square footage to a home. And who are they? One of the philosophical things that he and I started talking about through that conversation was, who are these people going to sell these houses to when they decide to sell? We're seeing the small ranches sell, the ranch homes, the ones that are in that sort of like 11 to 1,700 square foot range. But what about these bigger ones? These, 2-story, 50,000 different pitches to the roof homes. Who, it's just.
I'll let you know in about 10 years.
Okay. But that, and you being, I would look to you and I would say, does that legitimately concern you when you look forward in communities like Rushville and communities like Seneca Falls, Waterloo, et cetera?
I hadn't really thought about it until now, but now I'm pretty depressed about my future.
Right, I'll tell you.
Well, it's a good point. Just to use my community of Rushville as an example. I'm hearing this anecdotally, and I don't know. I don't have the figures, but I don't have any reason to distrust it. That the housing stock is shifting more towards rental. That we're seeing more renters. Houses that used to be owned by people are now turning into rental units. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. It's an interesting point, though, because again, that generational change. Who is going to buy my house if we decide to downsize? I mean, I turned 60 this year. If polar vortex willing, I'll get my mortgage paid off in a few more years, and maybe it'll be time to downsize. And that's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, I think we got a big old 1870 house that's about 2,400 square feet. I think, and that's, like you say, that's not what today's generation's looking for really anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is a shift, and I do. I think another part of this is I'm reminded of a conversation that I was listening to, I think on NPR radio, Evan Dawson's Connections. They were talking about the phenomenon of these large national, basically like housing chains, making offers on houses that aren't even on the market to buy them and to use them as rental properties. And it's a phenomenon that we're seeing. It happens more in cities like Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, but I can also think of a few properties locally that have fallen into that same pattern. So I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers that you were talking about a few minutes ago, we don't know the specific numbers. I think that there might be some truth to that, or there might be some teeth to that idea. Well,
and I wonder if we're going to head toward a society that's less into ownership. We have Clark Howard, who's a consumer show that runs on our radio station, and he was saying the other day, and then I heard this from another source as well, a lot of people are predicting that in another generation that we aren't going to own cars anymore. Now, caveat, in rural upstate New York, that revolution is going to get there a little later than it is in Stanford, California, or around New York City. But the idea being that instead of having a car that sits in the driveway most of the time, that will rent or use an Uber or Lyft type of service more, that a car won't be something that people will buy and own and maintain, that it'll be something that we hire when we need it. I mean, maybe we're heading towards just less of an ownership society in general, instead of owning a home. And I mean, it's great in some regards, but there's maintenance costs and a lot of things. I mean, that's what happens to a lot of older residents, is they reach the point where they can't afford the upkeep anymore.
Yeah, I mean, using myself and my fiance as an example, we rent, and honestly, we're in a complex where there's lots of other folks around, and things are really well taken care of, and it sort of checks off all the boxes that we're worried about as far as the living arrangement goes. We don't have to worry about maintenance. We don't have to worry about mowing the lawn. We don't have to worry about it. And it's interesting because that was one of the things with the development in Geneva with Lake Tunnel, is literally the concept of home ownership without having to worry about all of the things that come along with it.
Right.
Maintenance, the sort of like, things that a generation or two ago, you saw the father, the patriarch, leave the house, put his work boots on and start to mow the lawn. It's just, for whatever reason, whether it's because people are working 2 or more jobs to survive, or you don't have that stay-at-home figure to sort of keep the house in order while the one person is out making a living, whatever the team dynamic is or isn't what it was maybe 30, 40 years ago.
Well, my house that I own is the first I ever owned. I've never had to change jobs before while being a homeowner.
Right.
I mean, you like you say, you and your fiance, one of you gets a new job. It's time to move. When you have an apartment, you just give your notice and you go on to the next place. When you have a house, now you got to put the house on the market.
You have to buy a new one.
In upstate New York, which doesn't have the greatest economy in the world, go buy another one, and just there's a lot of complications that result.
Yeah, I'm reminded of my cousin. I won't say his name, but I believe when he moved from upstate New York to California, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they had bought the new house, and their house in Wayne County sat. They basically had to have a neighbor sort of sell the house for them.
Yeah.
And wait as the realtor worked through selling options. And it took I think over a year for the property to sell. And it's just that's the kind of, so in that time you're paying taxes on two places, you're paying two mortgages.
Right.
It's just not tenable. It's not a situation that really anybody, I'd say under 40, wants to get themselves into, because they see the writing on the wall as far as what can happen. Property taxes, like in Seneca Falls, could spike 65% in 1 year. Who knows? Never know.
Right.
Let's end on something positive, and I include a ton of snark when I say that.
You say you found something positive?
Yeah, no, I didn't. Amazon announced this week that they'll be teaming up with SUNY schools, CUNY schools, and I believe another school system down in New York City, to offer a certificate program in cloud computing. The program is expected to be rolled out this year and will enable students to learn the skills needed to acquire an entry-level job in the tech industry at Amazon or beyond. So my mind started to race after I saw this. I'm thinking to myself, so they're going to make these prospective employees of Amazon go through a certificate program at SUNY or one of the other state school systems, which both are now, as we understand, being backed and supported and funded by taxpayer dollars. They're going to make those taxpayers then go back and pay for a certificate program to get a job at the place where the government said, hey, we'll pay you essentially the equivalent of $2.5 billion to come here. How?
It's a great gig if you can get it. That's like being a pro sports team owner and demanding a new stadium, And the funny part is we kept hearing that this is these entry level jobs. I absolutely hate the idea of. I think we should just uncouple the term entry level job and college graduate of any kind, because the two should just not go together in 2019. They shouldn't. Entry level jobs should reflect a job that does not require a degree or any sort of post-secondary education. Well, but then again, I guess entry level at a tech company maybe has a little bit different meanings, where you need to have some kind of skills, and also entry level at a tech company might mean $100,000 a year.
Right, but that's the point. I mean, it isn't entry level.
Right.
It's
entry level in terms of entering that company. I understand what you're saying. When we think of entry level, we think of kid just out of school doing all the grunt jobs to learn the business.
So, I mean, there we have a scenario, and I believe that was where I the personal questions for me started to pop up when I was seeing what the average job or average position was going to pay at the Queens facility that's going to be built. This program will launch in fall 2019. I don't know when the actual HQ number 2 will be built and operating, but I guess it's all good if everybody can just get the ball rolling and make it happen. The thing I kept asking myself was, how are these entry-level jobs going to pay north of $125,000 on average? And that's how. It's not entry-level. You have to go to college. You have to complete a certificate program or a degree to actually get the job. And there you have this scenario. It's another barrier for everybody who doesn't fall into the upper middle class, and that's that. I mean, when you have folks who are making $80,000, $90,000 a year, struggling to pay for tuition or get their kids through school because they have 2, 3, or 4 kids, it's just this everything. The cost of everything is so inflated that it's unreasonable to throw this on top of everything else when the government is the one handing out these free passes for business, for corporations to do what they want to do.
You know, I'd never thought of it that way until you made that point. That's an interesting point, is should we be using taxpayer-funded educational institutions as free training grounds for-profit businesses? I mean, that's a good discussion to have. That's the role that a lot of them have been taking. I know FLCC works with a lot of local employers to try to design curriculum to turn out people that are ready to work. But the problem you run into is same with the Amazon problem, is you can't say, okay, we're going to make you start to pay for this share of training your workers, because they'll just go to somebody else. It's a bidding war.
Right.
You know, if you're one of these desirable companies, you can ask for anything you want, and if this community doesn't give it to me, then this one over here will, and I'll build my plant there.
Yeah, so I think to sort of go back to the point that you made, I think I'd be more comfortable seeing these programs at least be offered at a discount or for free if taxpayers are already footing the bill for the development the development in the first place via tax
I think there are some companies that do that. I believe there are some companies that offer educational incentives to their workers, to maybe to existing workers, right, to get more training. I mean, maybe maybe we should have some kind of a program where Amazon hires you right out of college or right out of high school to start 4 years from now. Right. And they pay part of the freight. I mean,
start like a minor league baseball system.
Right. Well, yeah, in a sense.
Start the farm system. You get the contract up front, and you are able to sort of, and maybe I hadn't really thought of that until just now, but maybe that's sort of part of the answer to getting people to plant roots and getting people to actually settle in the places where maybe they aren't otherwise, is creating a scenario where businesses themselves are incentivizing planting roots and actually settling down in a place where they are going to work long term.
And you get some kind of certainty if you know that, okay, I'm going to go through this 4-year program and be hired at this place afterwards, as opposed to, I just, right now, especially, I can't speak for the young generation, but I think that you can, and I think there's a lot of just economic uncertainty and fear that, is this job that I have today still going to be there in 5 years?
It's a real question. And it's one of the things that, folks who are my age, that's probably the biggest debate, is just what's going to be here. What's going to be in Seneca Falls or in Seneca County or even Ontario County outside of Geneva and Canandaigua in 30 years? It's just there's a lot of uncertainty there, and I'm not sure. Nobody knows the answer, but I think we do have to start coming up with some better ideas on how to address it. That was fast. We just blew through an hour like it was business.
Always fun.
So where can people hear you Monday through Friday? WGVA, WAUB, anywhere else?
You can tune in the Finger Lakes Morning News in Auburn, 98.1 FM, 1590 AM, WAUB. In Geneva, 95.9 FM, 1240 AM, WGVA. And FingerLakesDailyNews.com. Click listen. I'll be at various basketball gyms and hockey rinks near you.
Dig that. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. We'll be back next Friday with another edition of the program. Until then, stay informed and keep reading and keep doing all that stuff. All right? Bye.